And when you really get in the zone, as in you're a banjo player too, you get in that zone where you no longer are thinking about what's coming. It's just you're feeling it. And that's when it gets exciting, because there's sometimes I'll look at my left hand and I have no idea what I'm doing or how I did it or why. If I could live in that zone all the time, I'd be there. But that's what we all aspire to. And when it happens, you know.
Greetings, folks. Welcome into another episode of the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. This is Keith Billick coming to you from the natural confines of my suburban Detroit backyard recording studio. You know, some of those days you are inside trying to do stuff when you know it is warm and sunny out and you're just not going to be able to concentrate on anything. Well, fortunately, I have portable recording gear, so here I am allowing you to enjoy the sounds with me of nature and probably some traffic and maybe some overhead planes and, I don't know, some sirens. Who knows what'll happen. But either way, I'm happy to have you with me. I am back from 3 trips to Indiana over the last few weeks. The first was a performance at the Tri-State Bluegrass Festival in Kendallville. Then I was back down there teaching at Midwest Banjo Camp. And then my band Wilson Thicket just performed in Indianapolis. So it was great to have some banjo fun down in Indiana and also fun to run into a bunch of you listeners at various events. So to those of you who met me or were able to say hi to me, it was nice meeting you and seeing you. Other big news from Picky Fingers HQ. There is a sale on the world-famous Picky Fingers logo t-shirts. Any of those discontinued colors in all sizes, and then also all small and extra small shirts of all colors are on sale for the low price of $12 each. Head over to banjopodcast.com to check those out, and while you're there, you can also pick up Picky Fingers hats, stickers, the theme music with banjo tablature. Check it out, banjopodcast.com. You know, I mentioned it was great running into you listeners, and beyond just getting to know you, it's special for me because I quite literally could not make this podcast without your support. And today we have a very special VIP supporter to recognize and thank, and that is Landon Handy. Landon is a fellow Michigander of mine. Yes, that's really what people from Michigan are called. You can look it up if you want. But I see Landon posting a bunch of videos on Facebook of him playing his Michigan-built companion custom banjo. He's sounding great, the banjo's looking great, and Landon couldn't thank you enough for being a generous supporter of the show. And in case you were wondering, the way to do that is patreon.com/banjopodcast. Throw in a few dollars per month to keep the lights on here at Picky Fingers HQ, keep the show running, and you get excellent prizes in return. Once again, that's patreon.com/banjopodcast. You can also email the show at any time with any questions, suggestions, concerns. That email address is pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. Today's featured guest is Randy Barrett. Randy is a fantastic banjo player in both the 3-finger and clawhammer style. He's released several solo albums and currently plays with the band Big Howdy. He's based in the Washington, D.C. area and is also highly involved in the preservation and spreading of bluegrass music. He happens to be the president of Bluegrass Country Radio. He's an avid teacher and recently has added author and publisher to his credentials. He wrote a book titled On Banjo. That's a book that he collaborated on with Ben Eldridge, all about Ben's banjo style and his life and his views on music. Highly recommend that. Highly recommend that you check out Randy and his playing, and you're going to hear all about it right now. So give a warm Picky Fingers welcome to Randy Barrett.
I started at 13. I was visiting my cousin, and I was in the living room, and there was a banjo in the corner gathering dust. And I asked my cousin, Lulu, I said, Lulu, can I borrow that banjo and just mess around with it? And she said, no. And it pissed me off just enough to make me go out and buy a banjo, which I would never have done. Right? It just got me mad, and I was just like, "Ugh."
Out of spite, you spite.
I just like, So I go out and I buy a banjo, and I haven't had the slightest idea, but I'm kind of noodling with it in my room. A few weeks later, my mother walks by the room and she says, well, you're a regular Earl Scruggs. And I go, who is Earl Scruggs? You know?
Wow, I'm impressed.
Mom knew a whole lot more
cool.
about it than I did. So that was my origin story, and I fell into banjo that way. And then I had a good friend of the family who kind of taught me some basic roll patterns and things. And then I kind of, at that point, this is the late 70s, mid-late 70s, and there were a few books around, like Pete Wernick's wonderful book, The Bluegrass Banjo, which I learned out of, and it's still a wonderful book. I still use it for teaching. But mostly it was records. I learned from records, which was a wonderful way to do it. Now, by the time I came along, the record players no longer had the slower speed settings.
Oh, really?
Didn't have the 16, right? So you couldn't slow
couldn't do the thing.
Couldn't slow down and tune down, And so I was learning at speed, which was insane. I didn't know any better. It was the only way I could do it. And I'm lifting the needle and dropping the needle 1 million times. But that's how I learned.
Incredible.
It was just crazy, yeah.
To back up just a touch, do you have any idea when you were visiting your Lulu is your cousin?
Yes, Lulu, my cousin, yes.
What made you even interested in inquiring about this banjo in the corner? I'm picturing Wayne's World where he sees the Stratocaster. It's like, it will be mine.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
My family are musicians. My dad was a wonderful guitar player. So I was around string instruments.
Okay.
So it was just kind of an interest. I looked and said, oh, that'd be cool. Yeah. And then she's been chagrined ever since. And I keep telling her, no, you said exactly the right thing. Because if you'd said yes, I may have just messed with it and gone, eh. But since she said no, I had to get a banjo.
Apparently someone asked Earl Scruggs once, how did he get his sons all interested in music, and his answer was that he told them they weren't allowed to touch his instruments.
Right, exactly.
And so I think it's a bit of the same thing.
It's the reverse psychology thing. So
talk about, back to the learning off of the records. I'd love to hear about what you think that did for you.
Sure.
How well did you do at it? Did it maybe teach you some other things that you weren't trying to learn in the process?
Well, I came at it from a really particularly wacky angle because we had a good friend of ours who was very good friends with Eric Weisberg. And so she said, well, I've got this banjo album. So she goes into her record collection and hands me this banjo album, which was one of the greats of all time, called New Dimensions in Banjo and Bluegrass.
Yeah.
That was later repackaged as the Deliverance theme record.
Yeah.
That was the first recorded banjo I had, was that album, which is a crazy place to start.
Good way to start, but also a bit.
And that album was recorded in 1961 and it's as forward-thinking today as it was in 1961. I mean, they were just doing some stuff that was just way before their time.
Right.
So being a diligent kid with a lot of time on my hands, I started spinning that record and just note for note, just trying to figure out what they were doing. And it taught me ear training really quick. It taught me I really had to depend on my ear because at speed, you really. There were a few tabs that I guess Tony Trischka had one of his books from that record, so that was helpful. But 90% of that record, I learned every single note.
That's
from
really
the record.
Impressive. The times I've tried to learn things at speed, it seems like by the time you press play and get your hands back on the instrument, you're already like 20 notes behind.
I think it really helped to be a teenager where things just go in your brain and they stick. And I had a really neat experience because my stepfather was friends with Eric as well. And when I was 16 or so, I started at 13, so 16, 17.
Remind me where all this is happening.
So I was living in Eastern Long Island at that point, and which is not exactly the banjo capital. It was me and a lot of potato fields and geese, and which actually was good. It gave me time to play banjo. But so I got together with Eric around 1981 just for a lesson, And he was a real sweet guy, and I went over to his apartment, his house in Brooklyn, and I sat down and I started playing back to him this New Dimension stuff, which he hadn't heard in decades, and was amazed to have this teenage kid walk in playing every single note. So he was just flabbergasted and delighted, of course. I mean, he couldn't have been anything else. And we sat down, had a great time, and he was such a sweet guy because at that point, this is the early 80s. New York was not a very safe place at that point.
Okay.
And particularly on the street, people were getting ripped off all the time. And he didn't want me to take the train back, to where I was going with the banjo. Because it was like 10 at night,
Yeah.
So he said, look, you keep your banjo. I'll drop it off with you tomorrow, because he was going to the studio. And so the next day he dropped the banjo off, which was so sweet, because he just didn't want this poor kid to come out and get his banjo mugged off him. So, so that it was the best.
The joke will be on the criminal when they open it up and find out what was inside.
God, what are they going to do with that? But it was wonderful training, listening to the masters and learning from the masters on, actually, I'll back up for a second, because my first exposure to bluegrass singing was along the same time frame. And I guess maybe my brother had it. It was the Osborne Brothers Ruby record.
Uh-huh.
Now, Ruby.
Of course.
On your man at your man.
Yeah.
I'll take you to my shanty so cold. Honey, are you mad? You're mad.
I listened to that, and I was so appalled at the vocals, because what are these guys doing? This is the worst thing I ever heard in my life.
That's an intense first experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So I go up to the deck on the top of our house, which was next to a creek, and I flung that record off my deck into the creek. I got about 50 yards on it, like a Frisbee. And I was very pleased with myself. And after that, I sort of got used to the to the singing, because it takes some time, to get the singing. And the irony of it is, when I was working with Ben Eldridge on his book with him, he said, well, I've got a box of records that are going begging. Do you want any? And I looked at that box and I said, oh, sure, I'll take them. And what was the first record on that box? It was Osborne Brothers Ruby. Had come back to me 45 years later.
I found this one in the woods somewhere. I don't know how it got
in the
there.
creek. So there it was, sitting in Ben's box of records.
Incredible. We're definitely going to get to more of that context. I'd love to hear you talk about, if someone came to you and was determined to learn things at speed, what are you listening for? How do you start to tease that out?
That's a great question, because everybody, the slowdowners now are fabulous. And God, if we'd had that tool, when I was a kid, I'd be a 10 times better banjo player.
I mean, honestly, even with the slowdowner, listening to speedy bluegrass banjo
it still can
playing,
be hard.
It's still tough.
I just kept listening to the roll patterns and trying to figure out where they were on the neck, and literally listening 1,000 times. I mean, this is not a quick task,
no.
But by the 1,000th and first time it started to click. And I don't necessarily recommend it as the ideal way to learn, but it certainly was a way to really train my ear to pick stuff up.
Yeah,
which I still use, now.
So what happened from there? I imagine at some point you were interested in playing with people or jamming. How did you get into that stuff? I go to
high school and I, fall in with a few kids that are, playing folk music, and we jam a lot, and I'm learning. And at that point, still sitting with records and doing my thing, but starting to play with other people, because of course that's the most fun of all.
Yeah.
So I wasn't a shut-in just playing banjo with my record player. And so I started playing with kids in high school, friends, and then I got to college and, joined really kind of my first bluegrass band.
And where was that?
That was at Brown University in Providence. And we had a little band there, and with a wonderful guitar player named Matt Munisteri, who's really quite famous now, jazz player.
Yeah.
I really great player. Also a fabulous bluegrass guitar player. And he was that good when he was 19 years old too.
Wow, yeah.
So we played our butts off, and that's the kind of thing where you're playing until 3 a.m. and 4 and you're just playing and playing and playing. It's just, you're internalizing all the mechanics and all of that muscle memory that just becomes part of how you play.
Getting your 10,000 hours in, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's and they're fun 10,000 hours because you're jamming and having a good time.
Yeah.
So
who would you consider your primary influences at that point?
Well, so I'm, obviously Eric Weisberg, Marshall Brickman were the first. Bill Keys, of course. So I came in from the melodic side. That was the thing in the 70s. I mean, that was the cutting edge.
Yeah.
And then Tony Trischka, of course. Tony's wonderful. Who else? Alan Mundy, of course, who was I learned a lot of his stuff again, note for note. And then really discovered Ben Eldridge about the same time. And so between those people, that kind of group of players, that's where I was. So I've been working my way back to Scruggs ever since. They were all second generation players, having internalized Scruggs and then taken it further. So I kind of been taking it further and then walking back all the way back to
tracing the
path,
right.
Because it's there. It's like the breadcrumbs are all over the place.
Yeah, it's quite direct. Yeah.
And so it's been an interesting journey because most people do it the other way around. Now by the time Bela Fleck came along, and he's of course fabulous, I just couldn't grab what he was doing as far as the single string stuff because I was such a melodic, three fingers, and melodic brain because that's where I'd been, and that's really where the cutting edge was until Bela showed up. I ended up being a 70s banjo player because that's where I started it.
Yeah,
started with it, and I think we're all kind of a product of our time, and so
especially those formative years, the stuff that gets in your brain at that time, it just stays with you.
And I've been kind of like the tie that comes in and out of style. There have been times that I've been playing with some kids, young kids, and they go, "God, what are you doing?" And I'm just doing that's just melodic G run. They're like, "Oh my God!" So that's kind of fun. And then they that kind of happens, goes away, and then it comes back. So yeah, I'm a Scruggs and melodic player, and primarily a lick player.
So I'd love to hear about. You were saying that you were putting in all these hours with your college buddies and stuff, and learning stuff and between that and learning off of the records, it's stuff that you said you still use and still come in handy. Yeah. What are some of those things that you were working on that maybe are still like your go-to moves?
Let's see. I'll get Eldridge in here because he was such a huge influence on me.
Eldridgian? Is that what you just said?
Eldridgian.
I like it.
Yeah, I go. So it's that kind of stuff, and then the melodic, now those are the real melodic stories. And that's in the 70s what people were doing, which is all that pentatonic stuff, which is cool, but it's a little bit laborious. So stuff, what is something melodic? So it's chromatic and melodic stuff. Yeah, I'm like a 70s player. It's like,
yeah, that's cool. To get even more into the weeds with that, if someone really dug that style, maybe a student of yours, what are the exercises or pieces of music, or what should somebody be working on in their practice routine to develop those?
Really, you've got to get down your basic melodic, G, right? C. And so you've got to get, D. D's are, let's see. So things that are just. I'm like a bucket player, like as I tell my students. I've got my G bucket, I've got my C bucket, I've got my A bucket, my F bucket, right? And the more things you have in your bucket, right, the better player you are.
The more combinations you can do when you mix them all together.
Yeah, so I may have 50 ways to do some sort of F thing, but Bela has like 50,000, and that's why he's Bela.
Yeah, and he can make up new ones on the spot.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, from a lick playing standpoint, which is what I am and what Earl was and Ben was and Tony is. I mean, we were all lick players, so it's a matter of how many different ways you can recombine the stuff you have in your buckets. And you can grab them, and that's when it gets fun because there are times you can grab it and you don't even know what's coming. It's on the fly, and that's when it really gets exciting.
So yeah, it is. Even though it's pieced together from things you already know, it's still a form of improvisation because you've never done it in that exact.
You're recombining
way.
it. And when you really get in the zone, as in you're a banjo player too, you get in that zone where you no longer are thinking about what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you're feeling it. And that's when it gets exciting because there's sometimes I'll look at my left hand and I have no idea what I'm doing or how I did it or why. And someone will come up later and say, "Hey, could you show me that lick?" I was like, "No," because I can't remember. I mean, that's when you're really in the true improvisational, line.
Yeah,
and we live for those moments, right? I mean, those peak moments.
Way too few and far between.
Exactly. If I could live in that zone all the time, I'd be there. But but that's what we all aspire to.
100%.
And when it happens, it's happening.
Right, but you can't. You have to intentionally try to not think about that it's happening because as soon as you acknowledge that it's happening, it's
totally
not happening anymore.
It's zen. You got to go with the zen, go with the path, and forget the journey. Go with the journey, forget the destination.
There you go.
And
exactly.
And that's good advice for everything, I think, in life.
Is it skipping too far ahead to ask about, because now you're in the DC area. When did that transit, and you're fairly well established there?
So I was born in Washington and then moved away as a kid and then moved up to New York City and then out to Eastern Long Island and was up in New England. After college, I went back to DC. My dad was living there. My grandparents were still there. And it is and was a great bluegrass town. I mean, there was still just fabulous. The history there is tremendous. Most people have no idea. And I went back in 1987 to play music because I just knew people were there and that was a place to be. There was nothing happening in Boston. Yeah. Let me tell you, there was no Berkeley string program. Nashville was nothing happened in Nashville from a string standpoint. It was just dead. So I had family there, so I went back to Washington and have been there ever since.
So at that point, you had made a decision that music was what you wanted to do professionally. Was that?
That's a good question.
I mean, I know you were young enough that it's okay to just do stupid stuff based on.
Well, I was young, and but I ended up in a band, and then I fell in love with the sister of the bass player in the band I was in. So that's music is what brought me to my wife, which is wonderful. If I hadn't picked up the banjo, I would not have met my wife.
Bluegrass is for lovers.
Would not have had my children. We would not be having this conversation.
Yeah.
So I was suddenly and she had two little kids already. So I was suddenly a dad with kids at like 27.
Wow.
And which, at the time my father thought I was insane. Everybody's understood because my wife is wonderful. And it was like, yes, he made exactly the right decision. How could he not have made that decision?
But on paper, maybe.
But on paper, it was like, why is this 26-year-old, 27-year-old kid doing this? But I kept playing and then, I became a journalist. So that's what I did for a living for many years. I was a writer. So that's kind of how I paid the bills. But I kept playing, and just, teaching. And like a lot of us in bluegrass, we're not in it for the money. If we were in it for the money, we'd probably stay home.
I'm still holding out. I don't know about you.
But, you do something long enough and you're doing it and people start to know that you do it. And it's a nice place to be.
For sure. What band was this that you joined up there and...
Well, the band was called Rock Creek. It was a local band with Moondy Klein, great singer, who went to the Seldom scene afterward. Sally Truitt is my sister-in-law playing bass. Tom McLaughlin on mandolin. Tom is an old friend of mine that I met in Rhode Island, and just as I graduated from college, he had gotten laid off from his job. He's a electrical engineer by training, so he was kind of at loose ends. And I looked at him and I said, because we were playing a lot together and we really bonded in playing. And I said, I'm going to DC to play music. Do you want to go? And he said, sure. And he sold his house and moved to Washington. And we've been playing together for 40 odd years since.
Oh, you still do?
Still playing
that's
together.
Really cool.
Yeah. When you find people like that simply can finish your musical thoughts for you, you want to keep them close. Yeah. And Tom and I have been luckily kind of like brothers from another mother since then.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Which is wonderful.
I know you've touched on it a bit, describing yourself as a bucket player and stuff, but I'd love to hear even more about what you think of your own banjo style and how you hear music and how you approach music when you work around it.
It's like, as anybody, I think for any instrument, the more inputs you get, the more you pour into those buckets, the more you expose yourself to, the more you ultimately can create your own style. And so my style is firmly in the kind of the Scruggs melodic area. I try to be tasteful.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ultimate challenge, right? On a banjo is to play something worthy that's tasteful, and then to get the hell out of the way, for someone else to do something worthy and tasteful. So I'm just trying to think if I can play something. Let me try. Of course, I love fiddle tunes. Here's Bonaparte's Retreat. So it's just
great.
Yeah, just kind of it's 3-finger. It's and a melodic. I mean, I try to get as much emotion as I can into things, which, believe it or not, you actually can on a banjo.
Yeah.
As a banjo player, most people look at things, it's a bunch of notes.
Yeah.
But so it's a matter of just let's see, what else have I got here? Let me do Shuck in the Corn, because I did it tonight, but it's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Piece of that.
Yeah.
So it's
a little piece of a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff in there, just mixed in, and whatever feels good, and what settles in.
What was that high thing that you did? It kind of mimics like a higher up ground speed sort of thing. What's the pattern there, though? It's like kind of a G shape to
it's modal right there. Yeah, right. So it's a G. Right. It's really right.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hang on. There it is.
Okay.
I can do it fast. That's the one. Right there.
Yeah. Nice. And now a word from our sponsors, but we will be right back with the episode in just a few moments. The Picky Fingers podcast is thrilled to be sponsored by Peghead Nation, the top site for instructional video courses in banjo, guitar, mandolin, fiddle, dobro, upright bass, and ukulele. You're going to learn bluegrass, old time, and other styles from some of the most talented players and instructors in all of roots music. Go to pegheadnation.com to see their great lineup of courses. Here are some of the choices just for banjo. Beginning Banjo and Bluegrass Banjo with Bill Evans, Clawhammer Banjo with Evie Layden, Wade Ward Style Banjo with Bruce Molsky, The Banjo According to Danny Barnes, and Contemporary Bluegrass Banjo with Wes Corbett. All of these courses include high-quality multi-angle video lessons, downloadable notation and tablature, play-along tracks, and plenty of tunes and songs to play. The best part is that just for being a Picky Fingers podcast listener, you are going to get your first month free. So head over to pegheadnation.com and use the promo code pickyfingers at checkout. That's pegheadnation.com and pickyfingers, all one word, all lowercase, at checkout. I'm so proud to welcome a new sponsor to the podcast. That's Page Capos. Page has been family owned right here in my home state of Michigan since Brian and Ralph Page started the business way back in 1988. Since then, Page has become known for its high-quality capos for all the instruments, and folks, they have 3 different lines of capos, so whether you are just figuring out how these things work, right on up to if you are a demanding studio or stage professional, Page has a product for you. And just when you thought there couldn't possibly be anything new in the capo design world, they are proving that wrong with their new Page Pro series. I can tell you firsthand that the innovative patented design on these new Page Pro capos is second to none in both the tone quality, it sounds like you're not playing with a capo at all, and also the tuning stability. It's pretty amazing and you owe it to yourself to check them out. So head over to pagecapo.com. That's P-A-I-G-E capo.com. Picky Fingers podcast is also sponsored by Elderly Instruments. I have been so lucky to have Elderly Instruments as my local family-owned music store for as long as I can remember. But they are more than just that. They are the world's most trusted source for new, used, and vintage fretted instruments, which means they're the first place you should check for any of your banjo, mandolin, guitar, ukulele needs, instructional materials, and all the accessories to go with it. And the other part is that Elderly is just as well known for their excellent customer service as for their amazing selection of products. So head over to elderly.com to see their full inventory or give them a call to talk to one of their helpful and professional sales representatives. That's 517-372-7880. And last but not least, we have another family-owned business in Sullivan Banjos supporting the Picky Fingers Banjo podcast. A lot of you know that I have been playing my Sullivan banjo for about 20 years now, and I'm here to tell you that it is sounding better than ever. Now, fortunately for you, Eric is still maintaining that high Sullivan quality, and he is ready, willing, and able to build you the banjo of your dreams, whether you just want a tried and true traditional design on up through your wildest custom dream banjo. Eric is here to build it for you. Head on over to sullivanbanjo.com, email sullivanbanjo@gmail.com, or just go the old-fashioned way. Call up Eric Sullivan at 502-365-5022. Get that legendary Sullivan tone with that added personal touch of being able to design your banjo with the person who's actually building it for you. Backing up to the Bonaparte's retreat that you did, something that I really enjoyed about that was that a lot of times when I play fiddle tunes, I try to render a really accurate fiddle melody, but that ends up being very single note oriented, and you were able to incorporate a lot of rolls within it where it still sounded bluegrassy, but you still played like a true fiddle melody. I'd love to hear about your approach for doing that, or did you get that?
Mainly that comes from trying to get some rhythm and drive into it. I mean, the one thing about melodic is there's a lot of notes, and which is fine, and you can hit the exact notes. But I do miss having some of that,
Yeah, exactly.
In it, and that's kind of the way I've evolved doing a lot of those tunes.
Okay.
And some of them I do straight melodic, but there's let's see. So though I'm not an Irish player, I'm emphasizing, I'm leaning into some of those notes because that's where you get the propulsion. And if you listen to the Irish players, they're not just hitting the notes straight, ding, 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 all the way down the line. Yeah. So I'm always trying to just listen to what other styles of music are doing and just throw it in there.
Right. You know? And was it through your journalism that you got involved eventually in radio? or is that just kind of a different coincidence?
Well, part of being in D.C., I ended up being I was drafted. I had a field promotion to become the president of the D.C. Bluegrass Union, which was and is the main arts group, volunteer and a membership organization, and they put on concerts and do stuff. And I was with them. I ran it for 12 years.
Now, is this a union in like the common sense how we think of unions?
Like the D.C. It's like the Boston Bluegrass Union. A union of people. It wasn't a work union.
Okay.
And so I had gotten to know a lot of people kind of in the business from behind the clipboard. And that's okay. And the clipboard is okay, but then it can take over your life. But right about, 2015, 16, WAMU, that's the main public radio station, NPR station in Washington, they had been broadcasting bluegrass since 1967. In fact, bluegrass had been the first programming on the station. We're talking about a 50,000-watt FM station.
Right.
So back in the late 60s, colleges ended up with these licenses. They had no idea what to do with them. But they had to put something on the air. That was the deal, right? Yeah. Here's a license, put something on the air. And so the station was sitting there, the airwaves were sitting there, and one of the first shows they did was a bluegrass show just by chance. And that took off and became the primary format of the station for the next 25 years.
Wow.
Almost 30 years. So drive time bluegrass, we're talking at 50,000 watts in Washington. I mean, we're talking, this is a big radio station.
Yeah.
And people loved it. It was the big pole in the tent for bluegrass in Washington. It's part of the reason it got so famous is because you had this huge radio station that was doing all of this bluegrass programming. Then the university woke up, this is American University, woke up and realized they had a golden goose. And if only they could talk more, they could make more money. And bluegrass was doing pretty well, remind you. As far as pledges, it was doing amazingly well. But once they realized that they could start talking and making more money, they started talking a whole lot more and having a whole lot less music. So it was fading out, and they kept it on a sub-channel for a while, and they kept it streaming when that started. At least to their credit, they kept the bluegrass service going. But by 2015 or so, they were in some economic trouble and really needed to shed some of the assets they had. And to their credit, they didn't just kill the station off. They said, look, we really want to hand this to somebody. So we ended up putting together a foundation. We created a foundation called the Bluegrass Country Foundation, nonprofit, 501c3. Yeah. And we took over the station. We took it, everything, we took it over. So that's how I ended up in radio, which was sort of
like turnkey. You just moved in and
yes, we did literally. And really what was involved in that was not so much a station room or a control room. There was that, but really what it was the intellectual property. They had over 70,000, a library of 70,000 cuts and still growing, right? And they had a library of older material going back to 1967 that was on, you name it, tapes, CDs, every format you can imagine. But that's an incredible treasure trove of stuff because that's live performances, concerts, interviews.
Okay, I was going to ask, why is it their intellectual property? But they're the ones who generated it.
Right.
Okay.
So that's all was out. That was all that's essentially what we were taking over was the name, the library, and that back catalog and stuff, which we're still going through, and it's amazing what's there.
That was going to be my next question.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, we've got interviews with Bill Monroe, and we've got, and the station used to do a concert every year at the Fairfax High School, and all the major bands came through, and they were all recorded. So anyway, it's an amazing gem culturally. And so we took it over and had no idea whether it would work. And a lot of people said, yeah, good luck with that. And luckily, right about the time, this is 2017, people began to understand what streaming was. So podcasts started coming in. And at that point, we had no terrestrial signal left at all, except for the HD signal, which I won't bore you with, but is the worst marketed technology in the world. But if you have a car built in the last 5 years, even 8 years, there's a good chance you have an HD receiver in your radio. And that's a secondary receiver that every radio station now is broadcasting at least 2 signals. And they've got to put something on that other signal. So luckily, AMU...
Now, is the HD what allows for like the station identification and the playlist to come through, like on your car's dash with the song information?
Exactly.
Is that how you would basically know?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
That's what the HD signal does.
All right.
And so we push that as much as we can because that's for people in the greater Washington area. You can pick it up. The quality is fabulous.
Yeah.
Even better than regular FM. But most people don't know about it. So streaming is what really saved us. And so the station is at bluegrasscountry.org. We also have apps for smartphone. And people now, tune in on their smartphone. They Bluetooth it into their car radio.
Yeah.
So you can listen to Bluegrass Country and drive all the way across the country, and it never fades out, even in tunnels, which to me is just amazing. So
yeah, that is incredible. Forgive me for not knowing. Are you an on-air person at the station?
No, I'm the president of the board.
Okay.
I'm on air some. I do some announcing stuff, and I am doing a Ben Eldridge tribute show, which is really fun. And I do occasional programming. We have one whole employee. We're mostly volunteer. Mm-hmm. Chris Teskey is our program director.
Okay.
And he keeps the station running and does a lot of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, since you've brought him up a couple times, we should talk about Ben because not only is it relevant to the personal work that you've done, he's an influence on you.
Sure.
Why don't you talk about like what you heard in his playing that, I know you have lots of influences, but he seems to have a special spot for you.
I'm just a super fan. Where do you start with Ben? Just from a musician standpoint, I can't think of anybody else of the second generation, which he was, who had the knack he had for tastefully putting a banjo in places where it's not easy to readily apparent that you can. I mean, he had an amazing ear for little moments and little touches, and just everything was so clean and so tasteful that it just, from my ear, it caught it right away. I mean, it was like, what is this guy doing? And he also approached everything very differently on the neck. So it was just all of a sudden I kind of sat up and I was like, who is this guy? Because and that's just, anybody who's listened to Ben Eldridge understands that his playing he has a unique approach.
It's recognizable too, with the tone as well. Yeah. Completely
recognizable within 3 or 4 notes, it's Ben Eldridge. For him, it was completely intuitive. That's just the way he came and how he kind of brought it all together for himself as he went through his banjo journey.
Yeah.
So I had gotten to know Ben a bit when I was running the DC Bluegrass Union and being around Washington. And he was just a darling, sweet, just gentle soul. He was just the nicest, most self-effacing person you could ever meet. And so I was during the pandemic, the beginning of the shutdown, a lot of us had a fair amount of time on our hands. And I had heard an interview he had done with Katie Daly where he was mentioning what he was thinking about when he was doing the break to Last Train from Fore Valley. So really simple, super simple. And he said he'd been thinking of the playing of John Hartford.
Oh, I can totally hear it.
So you said that lyrical, right?
Yeah.
And the light bulb went off in my head, and I said, my God, there's no book, there's no record of how he went about any of this. And I called him up at the beginning of the pandemic, and I said, you need a book. And, God bless him. He said, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened. And to me, it was just the honor of a lifetime to work with one of my great heroes. And it was one of those great moments because often if you get to know your heroes, it's not the best thing that happens.
It's a little disappointing.
You begin to see the feet of clay and all that. But Ben was just as nice and as generous as ever. And he was a perfect guy to work with on it. So we went to work picking the tunes out. And I wanted to make sure the book is really a half memoir of his musical story.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting and just kind of amazing story of a kid who grows up, born in Richmond, falls in love with hillbilly music, listening to the Old Dominion Barn Dance, which was the radio show, which happened to be down the street. So he starts going. His mother takes him. God bless Mama, and he's like 9 years old. And he starts, just grooving on. And then he goes down and he hangs out with all the musicians during the break between shows. And his mother, his sainted mother, like hangs outside and makes sure he's okay, but still lets him hang out
Do
with
his
all
thing, yeah.
he's hanging out with Merle Travis and
the Carter sisters, if I remember right. Yeah.
And everybody, Grandpa Jones, and
Right.
all the big players, the country acts were playing on that radio show. So that's where he got the bug.
Uh-huh.
And so then he talks to his mother or parents into getting him a guitar. So his first guitar is a Gene Autry Melody Ranch guitar. And he very quickly, gets the hang of the chords and the changes and the songs. Because it came with a little book, with the chord changes and the words. So he's a smart guy, and he just had a great ear. And so he started playing guitar and just serenading everybody and just wandering around with his guitar. So it's an amazing story. And then when he was about 16, he asks for a banjo because he'd heard it, finally kind of tuned in on some recordings. And that's what began his journey.
That's really cool. Well, I can definitely vouch for your book. Is it called On Banjo?
On Banjo,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good blend of having great anecdotes about Ben, some really interesting and funny photos of Ben.
Oh, yeah.
Ben in his own words talking about how he approaches things, but it's not like this imposing, voluminous thing. It's very digestible. You get it's quick to read through with musical samples.
Good, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It's really cool.
It was, really what happened was by accident. I ended up putting together the two sides of my life. One was the professional as a writer. I was a writer, and then as a musician. Suddenly they just kind of, it's like they came together, and it was. I knew how to do it, and I knew what it needed to look like and read. Yeah. And so, and those are that's the way Ben talks. That's Ben's words. I mean, he had done a lot of interviews over the years, and then I did a bunch of interviews with him. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of combined the interviews I'd done with him, plus the interviews he'd done over 50 years. That's Ben. That's him talking about how, in his story, which to me is just cool.
Yeah. There's plenty of tablature too of some of, most people's favorite stuff that he did.
Right. Yeah.
How was that approached? Did you have a list of songs that were important to you that you thought reflected his style well, or did he have ideas?
It was both. I had some songs tunes I really knew I wanted in there because they were some of my personal favorites. Things like "Hail to the Redskins" and of course "Appalachian Rain" and some of these just classics. Of course, "Rider" had to be there. There's no question. Yeah. So I kind of had a preliminary list, and then I got together with him and said, "Well, what do you want here?" And then, and it's really interesting is we gravitated pretty quickly to the early recordings. I mean, the original band, the early recordings. And that's for a good reason, because Ben was on fire. He was just inspired. He played with this joyousness that's just infectious. You could hear it in every note. Mm-hmm. And I remember asking him, I said, "Well, Ben, we've got a lot of songs and tunes here, but they're kind of from the early stuff." And he played with the band for 45 years. And I said, "Is there anything you want to do from the other, 40, 35 years?" And he just shook his head. He knew what the good stuff was, and he wanted the early stuff in there. Which isn't to say he did wonderful stuff later, but the stuff that he was most invested in as an artist was the early stuff. And then you can hear it in his playing.
Did he offer, or do you have any explanation for why his playing sounds different?
You mean in general, or
I mean, you had described it that his early playing was, I think you said, joyous.
It was.
And I mean, you said he recognized that he was maybe a little more proud of that. I'm wondering.
Yeah,
I'm just kind of wondering why.
To me, I think it's. You really can't talk about that band without talking about the rest of the Seldom Scene. And I'm talking about the original Seldom Scene, as I call them, the Fab Five.
Yeah,
right.
That's cool.
Okay, so let's just talk about the Fab Five for a second. You've got Ben Eldridge, doing he came from his banjo journey, right? You've got Tom Gray, who had been with the Country Gentlemen, was one of the kind of preeminent bass players. He was only, when he joined the Gentlemen, he was only 18 years old. Mm. And he was hanging around. He was around. Mm. And then you had Mike Aldridge, who was refining dobro down the street. I mean, literally, we're talking in Bethesda, Maryland. Everybody lived within a mile and a half of each other.
Yeah. Wow.
And so you got that. and then you've got John Duffy.
Go away, darling Corey. Quit hanging around my bed. Bad liquor has ruined my body. Pretty women have gone to my head. Dig a hole in the meadow. Dig a hole in the cold, damp ground. Dig a hole in the meadow. Gonna lay darling Corey down.
I mean, we all know John's singing was singular and unique. And in my mind, there will never be a voice like his again. There will never be one that even is close. Because John had the ability to sing not only that bright, glass-etching tenor that we associate with bluegrass, he also could sing a gorgeous falsetto tenor. And he blended and dialed in between the two of them. He had two voices in one guy. And no one, if you look at the band now, there's two different guys singing his parts because, right, one doing the falsetto and one doing the bright, you know. So, and he had a way of selling a song. I mean, he was a singular talent. And then you got John Starling.
I won't have a woman brought a hurt and a sorrow, and it ain't gonna leave till you come back home. Rains today, gonna freeze tomorrow. The want of a woman makes a cold wind blow. Every day of my life, seen a glimpse of the sunshine.
Who is a doctor. You know, he's in residency. He's working for, I think he was with the Army. He becomes an ENT, ear, nose, and throat.
Yeah.
He's up in Bethesda Naval Hospital doing his residency, which again is like 2 blocks from where Ben is living.
And Ben himself is like a math professor or something?
Ben was a mathematician, was a real math genius, and spent his career as doing underwater acoustics and algorithms.
Oh, wow.
And he's as brilliant at that as he is at banjo.
Yeah.
And he won awards. I mean, he was, in that field, he's like one of the absolute top. He's a real Renaissance man. So, and he and Ben...
That's fascinating, but not surprising.
So he and Starling had met because they both gone to UVA. Ben as an undergrad and Starling is in med school. So they met a little bit, and then they were playing in the basement at Ben's house. They would get together. And so who was at the basement jam? So it was John Starling. It was Ben Eldridge. It was Mike Aldridge's brother, Dave. Tom Gray sometimes. So they just played for a bunch of years in the basement, and then you know, the big acts. And they were in a band together with Cliff Waldron, which was very important because Ben and Mike Aldridge were in that band together. Yeah. The first professional band either one was in. Yeah. Only lasted about a year and a half because they all had day jobs. They had families. I mean, they really were not up to doing the get in the bus or get in the van and drive for 1,000 miles thing. I mean, I can tell the story really quickly. It was a big accident. It was how the Seldom Scene actually came about because the basement band is playing at the Red Fox Inn, which is a little dive bar in Bethesda, which is about 2 blocks from Ben's house. Mm-hmm. And they're playing, and the phone rings, and Walt Broderick, who's the bar owner, answers it, and it's a bar owner down in Georgetown at the place called the Rabbit's Foot, which is a rock club. And he says, I want to try this bluegrass thing because it was hot, Right. And so who would you suggest? And so Walt Broderick says, well, hey, these guys on stage aren't bad. And so he calls Ben to the phone, and Ben says, well, sure. And he doesn't even check with the rest of the band. He's like, sure. And then they realize that they kind of have to get their act together because there's a few weeks that they're going to go play like a real place.
Nothing like a scheduled gig to whoop you into shape.
And so they start kind of banging around the idea of whether Duffy would join them and he was a legend. They were like afraid of him. I mean, they just venerated him. Yeah. And so, Starling calls John Duffy on the phone, and Ben has every expectation that it's just going to go nowhere.
Turn down, yeah.
And then he hears from John Starling on his side of the line. John says, Monday night? I think we could rehearse Monday night. And Ben says he basically peed his pants at that point. And that was how the Seldom Scene started. So it was an incredible accident. And so, but you ended up with those guys. Each brought their unique talent to this group that ended up, of course, the whole was far greater than the sum of the parts, which is what a great band is. And brought an urban sensibility to the music, which had never been there before. And that, to me, the magic of those 5 guys is what sparked Ben to play how he played. And if you hadn't had those 5 guys, he wouldn't have played like that.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't have been able to. You wouldn't have had the references, you know.
I think you're probably right. Yeah.
And he knew, and I think anybody that's listened to, say, the Cellar Door album, where you can really hear the energy and the excitement and the spontaneity of that group and the fun, they were having a blast.
Right.
And they all had day jobs. Nobody wanted to tour. They were like, no, we got day jobs. We're not touring. We can play a couple of local gigs here, maybe a festival. Let's just have a good time. And you could hear it and the infectiousness. And that's where that infectiousness came from. And so that's why I think Ben's, that early stuff, and if you listen to Eldridge, I mean, the early stuff Eldridge was playing was, again, just inspired. So go figure.
Yeah, classic.
Yeah.
Classic for sure.
Yeah. So that's kind of how it happened.
Hey folks, Keith here with just one more reminder that if you do enjoy what you're hearing from the Picky Fingers Banjo podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going over to patreon.com/banjopodcast. Just a few dollars per month really does help keep this show going, and you do get excellent prizes in return. So I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, and we'll keep these banjo episodes coming for a long, long time in the future. One more time, that's patreon.com/banjopodcast. Any other interesting anecdotes about putting that book together? I mean, I can highly recommend it to anyone who digs Ben's playing. It's an interesting book.
It was an interesting project because I got a chance to talk to people who had been around Ben. I talked to all the living members of the original band, and then including Phil Rosenthal, who had joined the band in 7 or 8, 9. And so I got a lot of background about the group and how it worked. And that was a lot of fun. And then, of course, the other thing which was really, really important was that magic was happening in the early 1970s in Bethesda, Maryland. I have no idea why Bethesda, Maryland, but the seldom scene starts playing and people start coming, literally lining down the block. And the word starts getting out and musicians start showing up, really top-notch professional, national musicians. So they're coming through and starting to grooving on the band and listening. And then you had this local folk singer who was like 20 years old named Emmylou Harris, who was just figuring out kind of what she was doing. And so after the after show, at the after party at John Starling's house, after the scene would play there one night a week at the Red Fox, became this kind of lightning strike of incredible music.
Just the hang.
It was the hang. And Ricky Skaggs was there, and Linda Ronstadt would come through. She was there. Keith Whitley, name it. Tony Rice. I mean,
it was the place to be.
They were just hanging. That party was the place. You'd go listen to the band, you'd have some beers, and then you go to John Starling's house, you play till 5 a.m.
Incredible.
And that was just as formative for all of them as any of it. And I would make the argument, and I do in the book, is that that's kind of was one of the moments of the beginnings of Americana music, when you look at who was sitting in that living room. And I mean, you could make an argument that happened in Texas too, and it did to a certain extent, but that to me is where the Americana music started. That, the Emmylou Harris end of it,
there's your
Linda
next book.
Ronstadt end of it. So that was really, really fun to be able to talk to Emmylou and talk to people and get that sense of what it was like to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Did you ever have a chance to see them in that general era?
When I first started listening to the scene, Starling had left, and Phil Rosenthal was there. And I thought Phil did a wonderful job. I mean, that was very tough shoes to fill. And as Phil will tell you, he was nervous as all get out, trying to think how are you going to fill John Starling's shoes. But the band was just smoking hot, so that's the era of band I knew. And then, of course, I knew them on record. To me, one of the most important parts of that band always was Tom Gray. His bass playing was that athletic, front of the beat, muscular bass playing.
Yeah.
And when he left the band, to me, it really didn't sound like the Seldom Scene anymore. It just didn't. I mean, everybody, that original bunch of guys really brought each the pieces that's what that sound was.
Yeah.
And I think Phil Rosenthal did a wonderful job and all, but that was the band I heard. I was lucky enough to be able to go down to the Birchmere and sit in the front row and just watch what Ben was doing.
Yeah, very cool.
4 feet away, which was really cool.
Incredible.
Yeah. So.
Well, I sympathize with the loss of your friend. He's a loss for the banjo world, but I'm it's a bittersweet blessing that you got to have that project with him. And,
it was an honor. It was a blessing, and I'm so glad we got the book done while he was still alive.
Of course,
which was just awesome.
Yeah.
And he was suffering from Parkinson's, and he was not having a good time. It's a tough disease. It's just he was so sweet because he would always rise in the occasion and be as charming and as nice as ever. But I mean, it was really
took
rough.
A lot out of him.
It took a lot out of him.
Yep.
So I was really, really glad to do that. And then it sort of set me accidentally into the world of becoming a publisher because I ended up starting a company called Barcroft Books to actually publish that book.
Yeah.
And so now I'm working with Tim O'Brien on a songbook, which is the next project.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
so that'll be fun.
So yeah, steer us back to. I mean, I could listen to you talk about Ben all day, but apparently we're supposed to be talking about you.
Yeah, that's right.
Get us up to speed about your current projects and what are your main banjo things that you tend to work on these days?
I just before the shutdown, which was an excellent time to put out a record, right? Just before the
seems like everyone did.
Oh God! So I on my bucket list was the item, banjo album.
Yeah.
Right. And so I did one, and it's mostly original. I'm also a clawhammer player, and I'd gotten into clawhammer and was writing a lot of clawhammer tunes. This really wonderful bunch of material, and then got together with Mark Schatz and Nate Leith and Danny Nicely and Tom McLaughlin, and it's one of those magic times in the studio when I think it was Quincy Jones that said about recording, he said you rehearse the band to 80% and you leave 20% for the magic.
Oh.
And that was,
I like that.
The thing is, you've got great players, you don't rehearse them all the way. You just let them, and that was one of those great moments. So anyway, I put this album out, it's called Shake, Rattle, and Roar. It's a combination both of clawhammer stuff and three-finger stuff, not at the same time. So that's cool, but it's not the same time.
Right.
And so I put that out on Patuxent Records, and of course then everything shuts down. But in the meantime, the band I play with in Washington is called Big Howdy, and that's my band, and that's with Dee Dee Weiland, a wonderful singer that most people remember. She sounds as wonderful as ever.
And what will I do now that you've left me? Is it too late for me to say, oh darling, leave our love alive? If we don't try, our love won't survive. How can it be true now that I'm losing you? Oh, darling, don't let our love
Ira Gitlin's on bass. And Ira's a multi-instrumentalist. Tom McLaughlin, my old friend, is on mandolin and guitar. So we've been playing together for over 30 years. And so we still have a regular gig we do up in Rockville, and we play all around the area. And we've got a new record we've been working on since before the pandemic, but we're going to get it done, and that'll be coming out. Big Howdy is the name of the band.
Very cool. And you do a lot of teaching, and I know about your, you can plug your YouTube channel too.
Sure.
You do the favorite licks.
Yeah, so
Fave licks.
The Fave licks. That was another of those pandemic things, is that I had time and I started putting just some licks up that I liked, and people seemed to enjoy it. And so I just started putting more. I think I'm at 32 or something. I'm still going. I got to go there and put another one up. People enjoyed it. To me, licks want to be free. They want to be free in the world. So that's where Fave Licks comes from. Check it on YouTube. Fave, F-A-V-E, Fave Licks, Randy Barrett.
And they span a lot of different kind of stuff. You have a good variety on there, I found.
It's just their favorite ones I've just used over the years, and ones that I've discovered recently, and ones, Don Reno stuff. And God, I mean, the sky's the limit, and it's all free. I don't. I didn't want to charge for it because it just didn't seem to be in the spirit of it. And then I walked through slowly, kind of break each lick down, and then people seem to enjoy it. So there you go.
Right.
And yep.
We need to talk about this banjo of yours. Tell me about it.
Well, this is since I'm a Ben super fan. I had gotten in my ear very early the sound of his Style 6 Gibson. That banjo, as you know from the book, it has an illustrious history.
Yeah.
It had been, well, I'll tell it very quickly, but this is a Style 6 Sparkle 6 banjo. This is a flathead. It's a lightweight flathead for the geeks. And since we're doing the Picky Fingers Banjo podcast, we can be geek and geek out. So it's a high profile, lightweight tone ring. Which they did not make many of these. They made about 125.
Did you mention the year?
1929.
Okay.
So Ben's banjo, which he calls Harvey because of the name up on the cover plate.
Yeah.
Originally been purchased and played by Bill Emerson, who had played Clean Time and a lot of other famous stuff on that banjo with Jimmy Martin. So Ben bought that banjo from Bill in 1966 for $600. It had originally been found in a pawn shop for $64, and I was able to go back to the original owner and find the original owner because his name was on the cover plate.
You found Harvey.
I found Harvey. His name was Harvey Richardson Brisset, was his name. It was actually, there was an accent on the E, which wasn't on the truss rod cover. Yeah. And I found his family, talked to his granddaughter, and learned all.
Oh, wow.
And so Harvey was a banjo player and band leader in Washington in the 1920s and 30s, and quite successful, and played on, the moonlight cruises up and down the Potomac and at the hotels and on the radio. He was pretty well known, and that's where that was his banjo.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. I don't know if I knew all that backstory.
Yeah. So that was so this one is and that was a lightweight for us nerds, a lightweight flathead. So that's got the very, very light tone ring. Uh-huh. Ben's banjo Harvey has a real snap to it. The sixes have they have a specific sound. So I had discovered this banjo that was in the collection of Turtle Hill Banjo, Dave Schenkman. It's a wonderful store that still exists. It was in Maryland. Dave had this in his personal collection for years, and I was always trying to wheedle it out of him. And the price went from insanely astronomical, until at some point it went to like ridiculously, stupidly expensive rather than insanely astronomical.
Yeah, is that
right?
lower?
It was just enough lower that I was like, okay. And so I purchased it, and it's one of the great banjos to me, and one of the great flatheads.
It sounds wonderful.
Yeah. These banjos. There's overtones coming out of these.
Yeah.
That's just totally unique. So the sixes are just incredibly, and yes, they're two-piece flange. It doesn't matter. People get hung up on the one-piece flange and on the full-weight flathead ring. I have 3 flatheads. I'm very blessed. I have this one. I have got a Style 12, and I've got a Style 3. And if my house were burning, this banjo, the Style 6, would be the one I'd reach for. It's just there's an
I feel like you could carry 3 banjos, though,
maybe,
Randy.
Yeah, but if I was pressed, this Style 6, which was called originally Royal Plectrum Tenor, has the absolute magic in it. And the fun thing, the backstory on this banjo is the neck is made by Monty Hendricks, the reproduction neck. I have the original Plectrum tenor neck, which was a fret longer. So you could do both plectrum on it and tenor, and it never really sold very well. It was one of those ideas that just didn't really. Anyway.
I don't know that I was even aware of those.
The neck is slightly longer than a tenor neck, and so you could tune it like a tenor and play tenor, or you could tune it like a plectrum and play plectrum on it on one neck.
But it's not really the best for either of those things.
Not really. Yeah. So it never really commercially it didn't catch on. And it also had an armrest mute in it, which this I didn't have. It's the one where you lean on the armrest, and there's an internal mechanism that would come up. Anyway, all these were innovations, but didn't really pan out commercially, because by then the electric guitar had showed up. So 1929, by the 1930, it's all electric guitars really coming in.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this banjo neck was made by Monty Hendricks, wonderful luthier out in California. And I got the story from him, is that this banjo was discovered in a house in Washington State, somewhere in the early 90s. And it was in a closet, and a guy was cleaning his house out to make it presentable for the next renters. He was cleaning up and painting it and for the next renters, a rental house. And he finds this banjo in the closet. And he calls up the tenants, the erstwhile tenants, and he says, "Hey, you left your banjo." And they say, "Oh, that's okay. You can keep it."
Oh, my God.
You know, I don't know about you, but this is a sparkle, gold-plated, engraved Gibson. And you don't have to know much about anything about a banjo to look at it and go, well, maybe there's something special about this. Maybe this is unusual.
Maybe don't give it away.
Maybe don't give it away. But these people are like, whatever, you know. So it ends up kind of coming out of hiding and went to Bonnie Hendricks for a knack and then to Dave Schenkman, and that's how I found it.
Incredible.
It's a really tremendous instrument.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Been enjoying it.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to say about you or your playing? Or
well, I guess the only thing to mention is that I sing, and I've been a singer all my life, and I came from a family of singers. And so when I started playing banjo, I didn't get that memo that banjo players aren't supposed to sing, or banjo players only sing baritone, like Earl.
Yeah.
So I'm all for encouraging people to sing with the banjo. There's no reason not to sing with a 5-string banjo with a 3-finger. You can do it. In fact, I'm teaching it here this week as kind of techniques to do it. It's not hard. It really isn't. So I do sing. I'm a songwriter, and banjo has informed everything I've done musically because it was the first instrument I played. So when I'm thinking melodies, I'm sort of thinking about a banjo,
right?
You know, so it's been the centerpiece to what I do musically and singing as well. So that's sort of my story.
So I don't have an excuse to not sing anymore?
There's no excuse, Keith.
Dang it.
There's no excuse. So, yeah, and
one more thing to not have enough time for.
Well, you know, and singing for people I know, it's a personal thing. It's easy to be bashful about it because it's coming out of your body.
Uh-huh.
You know, you're opening this hole in the front of your head.
Yeah, it's very
and
vulnerable.
It's coming out of the hole in the front of your head. You know, and so, yeah, it's very personal. But the more you do it, the more confidence you get, and the more you sing in front of people and bad things don't happen. And, you know, so I just encourage everybody to sing and to play. Yeah, that would be wonderful. And go support live music.
Amen.
Yeah.
How do people find you, Randy?
Well, you can find me at randybarrett.net.
And are we?
Website.
Is this 2 R's, 2 T's?
Yeah, it's Randy BARRETT .net. So that's my website. I also encourage people to definitely check out Bluegrass Country Radio. It's bluegrasscountry.org. And that's the place to go. But I was honored to be here. I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thanks again so much. I appreciate it from you too. I know that extra time is at a premium at these events, and it's just cutting into both of our sleep schedule.
That's right. But it's been fun, so thank you so much.
Yeah, sure has. Thanks a lot, Randy.
Yep, good.
All right, folks, that's going to wrap up that interview and this episode of the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. The song clips that you heard were Old Zeke by Randy Barrett, Pony Express by Eric Weisberg, Ruby, Are You Mad at Your Man by the Osborne Brothers, Darling Corey, and then Want of a Woman, both by the Seldom Seen, Appomattox by Randy Barrett, Don't Let Our Love Die by Big Howdy, and then finally Theme Time by Jimmy Martin. Thank you once again to today's VIP Patreon supporter of the show. That's Landon Handy. Head over to patreon.com/banjopodcast to become a VIP supporter yourself, or contact the show at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. That's going to do it all for me this time, folks. I'll see you next time.
You can save me from myself.